If you ask someone what fascism is, they'll probably have a hard time coming up with a definition. However, people have a vague idea of what a fascist is, even if they can't put it into words very easily. Fascism brings to mind images of dictators and grand military parades. Chiang Kai-shek was a dictator and a nationalist, and his soldiers even wore German helmets and goose-stepped. Thus, you'll hear people say that he was a fascist. This is nothing new. People called him a fascist while he was still alive. As George Orwell noted in What is Fascism, an article he wrote for the Tribune in 1944. So, was he a fascist? To answer that question, we first need to define fascism. Fortunately for us, the original fascist already answered that question. In 1932, fascist dictator Benito Mussolini and fascist scholar Giovanni Gentile wrote The Doctrine of Fascism. Fascism, according to Mussolini and Gentile, is an ideology where the state is everything. The fascist conception of the state is all-embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of a people. Now, totalitarianism can't be the entire definition of fascism because there are other totalitarian ideologies. The primary thing that distinguishes fascism from communism is that it eschews class conflict in favor of conflict between nations. Fascism is nationalism in its most extreme form. In the 1930s, there was a fascist organization in China called the Blue Shirts. They wanted Chiang Kai-shek to emulate Mussolini and make China a fascist regime. But Chiang Kai-shek refused. As J. Taylor writes in the Generalissimo, Chiang could be heartless and sometimes ruthless, but he lacked the pathological megalomania and the absolutist ideology of a totalitarian dictator. Chiang Kai-shek's government was authoritarian, but not totalitarian. Though there was censorship, there were newspapers that voiced criticism of the government. There were also opposition parties. In contrast, fascism is a totalitarian ideology, where nothing is outside the state and no criticism of the state is allowed. The ideology of Chiang Kai-shek and the Republic of China was called Tridemism, or the Three Principles of the People. I plan on going into more detail on this ideology in the future, but for now, I'll just give a basic summary. The three principles are commonly translated as nationalism, democracy, and welfare. Chinese nationalism, at least as it was interpreted by Sun Yat-sen and Chiang Kai-shek, was different than Mussolini's nationalism, as it rejected imperialism and generally sought peaceful relations with its neighbors. In his victory speech at the end of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek said that the war had been against the militarism and imperialism of Japan, and not against the Japanese people. Tridemism called for an authoritarian period of dictatorship to prepare the people for democracy. The transition to democracy happened in 1947, but then was canceled by martial law. But the martial law was eventually lifted under Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Ching-kuo. Fascism, on the other hand, sees totalitarianism as a permanent state of affairs. In conclusion, if you define fascism as just nationalism and dictatorship, then yeah, Chiang Kai-shek was a fascist. But if you use the real historical definition of fascism, then no, Chiang Kai-shek was not a fascist.